Now, the most common type of formative assessment is an oral assessment. The students talk, and you use that to find out what they've learned. So let's look at this a little bit more. One of the most common types of oral formal assessment is the question. Now, I've got another series of lessons on effective questions, but I want to look at some specific issues here. Actually, I find that there are three main uses for questions in the classroom. First, we use questions as formative assessment to check for understanding, and that's what our focus is in these lessons, so I'll come back to that. But second, sometimes we use questions to stimulate thinking. We want our students to think more deeply and critically about a topic, so we give them a question to consider. For example, why do you think Shakespeare included the scene with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet? We're not going to look at this particular use of questions here, but there's a third way I often see teachers use questions in class, and I'll call this the class management use. The teacher wants to make sure the class is paying attention, so she asks a general question to the class as a whole and expects the class as a whole to answer. So if she's an elementary teacher, she might be doing long multiplication, 3-digit by 3-digit multiplication. So she'll say something like this: okay, I need to multiply these two numbers. What do I do first, class? And a few students will say, multiply the ones digit by the ones digit. But only a few students answer. She said again, class, pay attention. What do I do first? So some more call out answers. So she does that. Then she says, okay, what do I do next? Okay, most of the students might answer. They'll call out things. It's just kind of everybody calling something out. Some might say, multiply the ones digit by the tens digit. Others might say, bring down the ones digit. And the class clown will say, get out your calculator. So the teacher heard somebody in the class, probably the most vocal student, give the right answer. So she does that and she moves ahead. Now, you've all seen this, but what's going on here? The teacher isn't really doing formative assessment. I mean, she has no idea who's answering what. She doesn't know whether most of the class gets it, whether only a few of the students get it. She has no idea who's answering unless it just happens to be the loudest one who has a voice that she can pick out. And this process isn't stimulating thinking by the students. I mean, the kids are just randomly calling out answers, whatever comes to mind. And some of them get it, some don't. The purpose behind asking these questions really is just to get the kids to pay attention, supposedly. So that's why I call it the class management use. Now, I think this use of questions is generally useless. I mean, it might make you think students are participating and engaged, because after all, a lot of the kids are speaking up. They're all looking at the board, probably. But most of the time, really, they don't need to be mentally tuned in at all. I mean, some students might know the answer and respond correctly. Others have just learned to echo them very quickly. When they hear the bright student start talking, they're able to say the same thing quickly. Those who don't know, they just stay quiet. Everybody else is kind of yelling out, and it's not noticed that they're not answering. And if they don't know it, it doesn't help them when they hear a cacophony of answers. I mean, if you hear 25 kids answering different things, it doesn't help you learn anything. Now, to be sure, there are times when you do something like this, such as you're doing a unison recitation of a Bible memory verse. Okay, in that case, you want all of them to answer, but you're expecting all of them to answer with the same words at the same time. But really, you should avoid this approach, this class management approach to questions, most of the time. Now, as I say, I have another series of lessons on questions, but these are just some things you can keep in mind as you ask questions for formative assessment purposes. Now, one thing, in order for you to tell what the students understand, you need to ask them questions that don't require them to read your mind. Now, you probably think, well, of course not, but I see this a lot, and we tend to do this, especially if we teach in the humanities, in Bible, history, and English. Okay, for example, a Bible teacher is driving at a particular point, so she says something like, okay, what was the greatest miracle in the book of Acts? Well, there are a lot of miracles in the book of Acts, and it's not obvious which one is the greatest. So what happens is the students start calling out answers. One of them says, Peter's released from prison. Another one says, Paul's conversion. Another one says, the Holy Spirit coming at Pentecost. And usually the teacher will take an answer and will say, okay, yeah, that's a great miracle, but that's not what I was thinking of. Finally, if a student stumbles on the desired answer, the teacher will say, yeah, that's it, and then they go on. Or if no one stumbles on it, the teacher says, well, I was thinking about such and such. Now, the thing is, this doesn't tell the teacher anything about the level of understanding of the students, whether or not they hit on the desired answer. I mean, they're just calling out things. A better question might be, the first miracle in the book of Acts was, with the answer being the ascension of Jesus. Okay, that will tell the teacher if the students have been grasping what she's been teaching. Okay, so don't ask questions where you're just kind of fishing for an answer to try to make a point so you can move on. That's just mind reading. Also, you need to think specifically about what you want to know. What are you looking for the students to know from this lesson? If I want them to know the sum of the angles in a triangle, then my question might be, what's the sum of the interior angles in a triangle? Or a different way, I might say, if one angle in a triangle is 30 degrees and another is 60 degrees, what's the third angle? If I want them to know the best way to attack Tokyo, I might say, what obstacles will I face if I approach Tokyo from the east? The point is, your questions should be designed to give you good data as to whether your students understand the material or not. Remember, you're not asking questions just to get students to pay attention, the classroom management approach. You're soliciting feedback so you will know their level of understanding. This requires that you plan your questions ahead of time. What can you ask that will give you good information about your students' understanding? Now, I'll tell you, it's difficult to come up with these on the fly. Jot down some good questions ahead of time. Think, what is this lesson about? What can I ask the students to see if they understand? Now remember that for formative assessment to be effective, you need to be finding out about all students systematically. So for this purpose, having students just raise their hand and you call them the first one raised is not effective, because you'll find out you have the same few students all the time answering. And what I've also seen is a teacher will say, I'll ask a question and they'll say, okay, someone who hasn't answered yet. That's not that effective either. Really, you need to have a way to make sure you're asking everyone. Some teachers write students' names on popsicle sticks and they have them in a jar, and every time they go to ask a question, they just pull one out of the jar. Some teachers have a software app on their phone to randomize the names. Whatever you do, find some way that you're calling on all the students and that you're not just calling on them in order, because then they get to the point where they're tuning out. If it's not their turn, then they're not even thinking. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, if I ask one student a question, the other students will hear his answer and that'll help them. Generally, this doesn't really happen. For the other students to learn a bit of information, it doesn't help them just to hear somebody else say it. Students need to process it themselves mentally. They need to think about it. So just hearing another student say something really doesn't do anything for them. You need to regularly question every student to determine what they know. Now, the use of discussion is an important means of formative assessment, as well as being a way to engage students and to get them to think more deeply about the content. But you want to be sure that you have true discussion. A lot of times what teachers call discussion can be called the beach ball method. That is, you throw a question to a student like a beach ball, he answers you, throws the beach ball back to you. Then you throw it to another student who throws it back to you, and that keeps going. Instead, what you want in a discussion is for the teacher almost to be able to step aside entirely and have the students themselves interacting with each other. So you present a question for discussion. One student answers, and then another one follows up, either with more information or to ask the first student a question. Then another one jumps in, and so on. You can stand back and watch. You can see who's processing the content, who's digging into it. I mean, this is the formative assessment aspect of this. Occasionally, you might jump back in to redirect the discussion toward a particular point or to help correct misconceptions, but the students should be doing most of the talking. Now, this takes some time for you to train the students. I mean, it even involves room arrangement. Instead of having all the students facing the front, have them turn their desks so they're facing each other. Then ask a question. When one student answers, instead of making a judgment about it, like saying, yeah, that's right, or no, that's not right, and instead of expanding on the answer yourself, which I hear a lot of teachers do, just ask, okay, who can add to that? I notice I didn't say, can anyone add to that? I mean, that allows the students just to think, no, I can't. When you ask who can add to it, you're assuming someone can and will do so. So, let's say the first student who answers says something wrong. Again, just ask who can add to that. Allow other students to correct the first one. After a few minutes of this, you might then step back and say, okay, let's think about the discussion we just had and kind of debrief them. You might say something like, Mary, when you disagreed with Susie, it would have been more helpful to say something like, I see what you're saying, but... And then you might say, Johnny, when you followed up what Billy said, you basically said the same thing he did. You should be thinking of something you could add to the discussion. So take some time to train students how to engage in profitable discussions. After you do this a few times, you'll find that the students start doing it on their own without you having to prompt them by saying who can add to that. In fact, you might even post a list of questions they can ask each other, like these. Could you describe what you mean? Use this to ask for clarification and explanation. Where did you find that information? This is for when students want to ask somebody to justify their statements. I don't agree because... So this is to recognize and challenge misconceptions. Can you give me an example? I mean, this is demanding evidence for their claims and arguments. Well, Billy suggested students would use this to interpret and use each other's statements. So like I say, you might just post these questions and it will give students ideas of ways they can follow up with one another during a discussion. Another means of verbal formative assessment is summarizing or retelling. For example, after you've just taught about the first moon landing, ask a student to summarize what you said without looking at their notes, without reading it. Or, if they've had to read a chapter in Moby Dick for homework, ask students the next day to divide into small groups and take turns telling each other what happened in the chapter, with their books closed. Now, you'll probably need to demonstrate this some. Show them, okay, this chapter, here's how you hit the main points. I'm leaving out small details. I'm saying things in my own words. Show them what you want. And one good way to introduce this concept is to say, let's say you went to a great movie last night, and the next day your friend asks you, well, what was that movie all about? You're going to take a minute or two and tell him the main plot of the movie. Well, do the same thing with this part of the book. Imagine that you just went to a movie about it. What are you going to tell someone else about it? You see, if someone can really summarize something, they hit the main points, they omit lesser details, they're demonstrating a good level of understanding. If all they can do is read sentences verbatim from the book, or if they just focus on some minor detail, they haven't really understood what they read. So this gives you good feedback on their understanding. Now, these are just some ideas about making use of oral formative assessments. I'm sure you can think of others. The point, again, is for you to find out what your students understand and what they haven't gotten yet, so you can plan your follow-up instruction. Please drop me a note if you have questions. Thank you.